Fancy seeing you here. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. This week, Canada hosted the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta. And as chair, I focused on strengthening international partnerships with leading nations around the table to find areas of cooperation on shared priorities. À nouveau, le monde entier a pu voir la valeur de ce forum. De nombreuses discussions franches et ouvertes ont lieu entre les nations qui façonnent l'économie mondiale. Nous avons trouvé un accord pour bâtir des économies plus fortes en rendant le monde plus sécuritaire, en promouvant la sécurité énergétique et encourageant les partenariats de l'avenir. Nous avons quitté Kananaskis avec de nouvelles opportunités pour le Canada sur les minéraux critiques avec d'autres pays, sur l'intelligence artificielle, sur les chaînes d'approvisionnement, le commerce et bien plus encore. Now, Canadian leadership will be defined not just by the strength of our values, but also by the value of our strength. The world wants to do much more, and work much more closely with Canada, and we're ready. Now, on Monday morning, I, with colleagues, met with President Trump to discuss international priorities as part of the G7, but also to further negotiate a new economic and security partnership between Canada and the United States. And as we've said repeatedly, we'll take all the time we need to get the best deal for Canada, but no longer. And seeing progress that's been made, President Trump and I agreed to pursue negotiations towards a deal within the coming 30 days. We'll continue these negotiations, of course, in good faith. In parallel, we must reinforce our strength at home and safeguard Canadian workers and businesses from the unjust U.S. tariffs that exist at present. And that's why we're announcing that Canada will be introducing a series of countermeasures to protect Canadian steel and aluminum workers and producers. And there's several, and I'm going to list them. First, Canada will adjust its existing counter tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum products on the 21st of July, at the end of that 30-day period, in other words. We're going to adjust them to levels consistent with the progress that's made at that point on the broader trading arrangements with the United States. Secondly, we will implement reciprocal procurement rules, ensuring that only Canadian producers and producers from trading partners that provide Canada with tariff-free reciprocal access through trade agreements can compete for federal government procurement of steel and aluminum. Troisièmement, le gouvernement établira de nouveaux quotas tarifaires de 100% sur les niveaux d'importation de produits d'acier de 2024 en provenance de pays pour stabiliser le marché canadien et d'empêcher un détournement commercial dommageable suite aux actions prises par les États-Unis. Ce quota seront appliqués réactivement et seront réexaminés dans les 30 jours. Quatrièmement, le gouvernement adoptera des mesures tarifaires supplémentaires au cours des prochaines semaines pour s'attaquer aux risques associés à la surcapacité mondiale persistante et au commerce déloyal dans les secteurs de l'acier et de l'aluminium qui sont exacerbés par les mesures américaines. Les mesures canadiennes s'appliqueront selon le principe du pays de fond et de coulage pour l'acier et du pays de fusion et de moulage pour l'aluminium. The Government of Canada will also review its remission framework for automobiles to favor the use of Canadian steel and aluminum in Canadian-made products. And finally, we're creating two government stakeholder task forces, one for steel, one for aluminum, to monitor trade and market trends and to better support government decision-making and workers going forward. Remind that the $10 billion large enterprise tariff loan facility remains open to help affected businesses access the liquidity they need and to return to financial resilience as the market stabilizes. In short, the government is responding to the impact of the unjust U.S. tariffs with multiple tools. We will review our response as the negotiations progress. I'll be meeting with the premiers of the provinces and territories tomorrow to discuss this response and our broader coordination going forward. Next week, I will attend the Canada-EU Summit, as well as the NATO Summit, as part of Canada's new government's mission to strengthen and build security and economic partnerships with reliable partners. And this week, in this House, the Parliament has the opportunity to pass the core of our domestic economic response, the One Canadian Economy Act, because together, we as Canadians can give ourselves far more than the Americans can ever take away. Steel and aluminum workers are on the front lines of this trade crisis. These are the workers who will help us build one strong Canadian economy, the strongest economy in the G7. Alors, nous les protégerons, ainsi que leurs familles, et nous le ferons avec urgence et détermination. Merci beaucoup, and now the ministers and I will be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Merci, Monsieur le Premier ministre. Nous allons maintenant commencer la période de questions. We'll start with the first question. Najib.
Najib Amelis, the Globe and Mail. Are you imposing anti-dumping tariffs because the U.S. asked you to as part of these negotiations over the 30 days?
The short answer, no. There was not a request from the United States, but it's a consequence of the U.S. actions. As you know, the U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum are global tariffs. They're not targeted specifically at Canada, but they, of course, affect our steel industries and our workers. And one of the consequences of that effect, or prospective consequences, is that steel from other countries, from third countries, start to come into Canada if we don't protect our industry. So we're setting these quotas. It's a long word, tariff rate quotas, but a quota for the amount of steel that can come in from third countries to limit that amount, to stabilize the market. And to be clear, we will be reviewing the level of those tariff rate quotas as this progresses. It depends on what the United States does, first and foremost with Canada, whether we come to an agreement in the next 30 days, but also what they do with the rest of the world. Non, ce n'est pas une requête du gouvernement américain, c'est pour notre industrie. Mais le point est, c'est une réponse à l'impact global des actions des Américains. Parce qu'il y a le marché de l'acier et de l'aluminium sont déstabilisés par les tarifs globaux des Américains et il y aura possiblement et probablement des retombées négatives ici au Canada. Alors avec les quotas, on protège nos marchés et nos travailleurs. Merci.
And will the government be rolling out any additional support for the industry beyond the emergency loans that you mentioned? For example, would the government ever consider investing directly in a steel producer?
Well, it's an important question, and I'll say the following. First is that we're united in working on all forms of support for the industry short-term, tariff measures we're announcing today, liquidity as necessary, but also a necessary restructuring of demand and the industry that will happen almost irrespective of what happens between Canada and the United States because of the global impact of the new U.S. trade policy. So that starts with buying Canadian steel and aluminum for federal projects, working with the provinces to do the same, making sure that the enormous infrastructure bill that's about to happen in this country, if we get the One Canadian Economy bill through Parliament, the impact of these nation-building projects, making sure that those are taking advantage of our industries. Same with autos. Same with the new defense spending that will be considerable over the years. And what we're working together is on those policies to encourage the consumption of Canadian steel and aluminum, but also we will be looking at how to finance the bridge of two industries that have been very oriented north-south, not exclusively, but very oriented north-south, to be oriented towards Canada first, and then globally with reliable partners. Thank you.
Next question.
That's great with global news. Are you willing to sign the security and economic agreement that you've been negotiating with Mr. Trump if any of the Trump's tariffs are still in place after that deal is signed?
We're willing to sign a security and economic or commercial agreement with the United States that's in Canada's best interest, and only that. So that's the negotiation. That there is still some room to travel, so to speak, before we get to that point. But we have a deadline in order to achieve that. And if it's in Canada's interest, we'll sign it. If it's not, we won't.
So you're willing to sign a deal with the Americans and still have some of the tariffs that Donald Trump has signed still in place?
Ça dépend. It's a negotiation right now. I was anticipating the en français. Sorry, yeah, it's a negotiation. We start from a position which is clear in terms of the tremendous contribution of Canadian workers, Canadian companies, first and foremost to jobs and livelihoods here in Canada, but to the competitiveness of the American, for example, specifically in the auto sector, where steel is and aluminum are so tightly tied, and our auto companies are so tightly tied. We are part of the core that makes American automakers competitive. It is in the U.S. interest as well. They have to fully see that. Thank you. En français, j'ai oublié la question. C'était là dans ce moment. Alors, on verra. C'est une négociation. C'est mieux pour les Américains et surtout pour le Canada, évidemment, d'avoir une libre-échange, une vraie libre-échange, surtout dans les secteurs de l'acier, l'aluminium et l'automobile. Mais c'est une négociation, on verra. Mais nous allons signer, en effet, seulement un accord dans l'intérêt des travailleurs canadiens.
Next question.
How often are you communicating with President Trump and to Mr. LeBlanc? What are your tasks during this next 30-day negotiating period?
Okay, so I'll answer
both, sir.
No. I think I would like to hear from Minister LeBlanc. The President and I communicate, I would say, relatively frequently on a range of issues. From our perspective, obviously, this is top of mind. But Mr. LeBlanc.
So, thank you, Prime Minister. I'm having ongoing conversations with Secretary Lutnick. Ambassador Hillman and I met following the Prime Minister and the President's meeting in Kananaskis with Ambassador Greer and officials who were with the President in Kananaskis. We've agreed to have another meeting tomorrow. So I'm following up, as the Prime Minister said, conscious of the deadline that he and President Trump fixed. The fact that there's now a deadline set by the two leaders, I think, has focused the conversation. So I'm optimistic over the next 3.5 weeks that we can make some progress. And I'll be reporting to the Prime Minister as that progress unfolds.
Thank you. And for the Prime Minister, what are Canada's goals during these 30-day talks?
Well, I mean, the high level is the best result for Canadian workers and businesses, first thing. Secondly, for that to be the case, we need to stabilize the trading relationship with the United States. We need to have ready access to U.S. markets for Canadian companies and for Canadian companies, and not have our hands tied in terms of our dealings with the rest of the world. Because I'll go back to something I said at the start and heard in every single interaction in Kananaskis. The world wants to work with Canada. The world wants to work with Canada. Minister Joly was just in the aerospace, with the aerospace industry in France a few days ago. Minister Champagne elsewhere. People want to work with Canada. We have major delegations visiting here. And so access to the U.S. for our mutual benefit, but very much an ability to trade with the rest of the world, which we intend to take advantage of, regardless of the outcome of the discussions with the U.S.
Next question.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. David Baxter with the Canadian Press. Just earlier you were talking about the importance of getting C5 passed. Last night we were hearing that the way this bill is being handled is laying the table out for a potential Idle No More 2.0. Are you prepared for a potential summer of protests, and how do you properly address the concerns raised by a host of Indigenous organizations at this point?
I mean, the first thing is that at the heart of this legislation is Section 35 of our Constitution. At the heart is not just respect for, but full embrace of free, prior, and informed consent. It has to be seen as well in parallel with very major measures that this government is taking to not just support those partnerships, but also to finance equity ownership in these nation-building projects for Indigenous peoples, Indigenous groups, Indigenous right holders. That's the first point. The second is that this legislation is enabling legislation. It creates the possibility of these projects. Now, there's lots of suggestions of what the actual projects could be, but it creates the possibility, but a very clear process, which has at its heart consultation, full consultation with Indigenous peoples to define what is a nation-building project. And then, if something is one of those projects, then what are the conditions in order for that project to move forward, including participation, obviously, I would think, in almost every case, environmental, other conditions, and then only if those conditions are met would the project move forward. So consultation, cooperation, engagement, participation is at the heart of C5, and that is how you build a nation, and that's very much how we've designed it, how we believe it, and that's how we'll be moving forward.
Yeah, and just on India, what's changed in the last 8 or 9 months or so where Canada is ready to have Indian diplomats back in the country, including a high commissioner? And did Hardeep Singh Nijjar come up at all in your conversation with Prime Minister Modi?
Well, let me go back to a very basic level, because this is a basic, almost foundational, necessary first step for the relationship, which is to exchange high commissioners and re-begin effectively diplomatic service and consular service. There are very deep ongoing ties of people to people, not just certainly of Indo-Canadians, but of Canadians as a whole with India. We don't have a high commissioner in India right now. We're not serving Canadians in India right now because of where we are. I mean, the reciprocal would hold for the Indian government. So just having a basic level of engagement is, in many respects, a duty of the government. I'm glad that we came to that agreement understanding. That agreement understanding also is based on several things. The law enforcement cooperation, which clears things. Understanding of issues of transnational repression, which were discussed not just at the G7, but also in the discussions the Prime Minister and I had. Look, I'd never make it a policy to give a line-by-line transcript readout of exactly what's said in a meeting, and I'm not about to start now.
Next question.
Prime Minister, good afternoon. Greg Quinn with Market News. I have a document showing some of the fiscal plans for this year.
Look at that. It looks like it's written on a napkin, Greg.
Well, I don't know whose napkin it is. It said there's a contingency borrowing authority.
Is that the opposition's fiscal plan?
No, it's finances. It says there's a contingency or an option to borrow 95.
What kind of shop are you running? Sorry, Greg. I'm sorry. I respect. Yeah.
Just the executive summary. That's the executive summary.
Okay, start again. You have a document. I'm sorry. I treat it with.
It outlines fiscal plans for this year, and it mentions an option to borrow up to $95 billion, excuse me, to cover geopolitical risk. You know, we're in the middle of some delicate trade talks with the U.S. I just wondered, in these circumstances, why do we need to set aside that amount of money to get through this?
Well, in all seriousness, obviously, by my response to your document, I haven't seen what you're talking about, so you're asking me to comment on something I haven't seen, full stop. Then I'm going to tell you something you already know, which is that any responsible government makes contingency plans. The world is in a trade war. The world's in a trade war. that is running a risk of a global recession. And if I would note, and you don't need to take it from me, I'll quote the chair of the Federal Reserve this week, who highlighted the risks of stagflation, in other words, inflation. In their judgment, Federal Reserves, what do they know? But this is what they think, that inflation is going up and growth is going to slow in the United States. The world's in the middle of a trade war and several wars, actual wars, including wars that can have quite significant implication for commodity prices, global growth, aside from the human cost that comes with them. Any responsible government, any responsible organization makes contingency plans for those circumstances.
Second, I'd like to turn to talk of making Canada an energy superpower.
Yep.
Danielle Smith has said, there could be a referendum next year, and the legislation around that is 170,000 people can put that on the ballot. Brian Mulroney once perhaps referred to rolling the dice with the future of Canada. Is it appropriate for that few people to put the fate of a G7 nation in the balance?
I see what you're trying to do. The province of Alberta, provinces make determinations on the rules governing referenda, voter plebiscites, other factors, and they can make determination on how they come into force. Determinations on broader issues of referenda on federal level, including supported by Supreme Court decisions, are governed by the Clarity. I will refer to the Clarity Act. But look, what we're interested in, what Canada's new government's interested in, what Parliament, I think most parliamentarians are interested in, is building this country, not breaking it apart. It's working together, working with Indigenous peoples, working with provinces, working with labor, working with business. We have many, we have this threat, this realizing from the U.S. that regardless of what outcome we get, it matters what agreement we get, but it's changing the world of trade. It is changing the outlook for the global economy in not just immediate, but the medium term. We have to take more responsibility ourselves to move forward, which is what we're doing with the One Canadian Economy Act and what's underneath it, which very much includes, and I'll finish on this, very much includes cooperation with the province of Alberta, the province of Saskatchewan, province of British Columbia, all the provinces and territories, Indigenous people, for these nation-building projects. And we're having constructive, I would say, very constructive discussions with Premier Smith and stakeholders in Alberta specifically, and we intend to convert those to actual projects, investment, jobs, and a brighter future for the country.
We'll have time for one last question. Dernière question.
Minister Michael Couture with CTV News. The Haute Commission and now the CSIS report says that India is one of the main perpetrators of foreign interference and espionage in Canada. I know you don't want to give a line-by-line conversation about what you had with Prime Minister Modi, but given how this does affect Canadians very personally, what did you say to Prime Minister Modi about it, and did you tell him to stop it?
We've made our position very clear, including recently, that we will not tolerate transnational repression in Canada from any source, geographic or institutional. Nous sommes absolument clairs que c'est pas acceptable du tout d'avoir de l'ingérence étrangère ici au Canada, n'importe quel pays, n'importe quelle institution.
Ask you about the conflict in the Middle East and whether or not you support the U.S. directly striking Iran in the goal of diminishing their nuclear capacity.
I'll say the following, which is that the prospect, in any sense of that word, of Iran having a nuclear weapon is fundamentally destabilizing to peace in the Middle East and broader peace and stability in the world. We support, at first point. Secondly, we absolutely support and stand by Israel and in its right to defend itself and protect itself. We join others in looking for a resolution of this crisis that ensures that there is not a nuclear weapon or nuclear capacity in Iran, that ensures the safety and stability of all countries, Israel included, in the region, and that leads to broader peace in, or prospect of broader peace in the Middle East. And I'll draw attention to the G7 statement agreed by all G7 leaders that the resolution of this crisis should be accompanied by a ceasefire in Gaza. Thank you very much.
Merci, c'est ce qui m'a fait à la conférence de presse. This puts an end to our press conference. Thank you.
En français. Non, c'est seulement une traduction. C'est seulement une traduction.
On
J'étais
va
ici.
on va faire la traduction en français, mais on doit quitter
Mais
pour QP.
oui,
Donc,
c'est en
on doit
français.
quitter pour la période de questions. Merci.
C'est fait.
Merci tout le monde.
Merci.
Bonne journée.